Last time we went over forms, and the main point of the lecture last time was to go over sort of the concept and show a very simple example that we're definitely going to expand on in this class and probably some next Monday too. We have sort of, let me think how I want to count this. We have sort of 4 topics underneath forms that I want to go over. I want to go over more form controls because we went over the basic text box, which allows you to enter in a single line of text. And that's okay for some things, but it's not okay for everything. And we'll talk about why you would not use that. We will talk about laying out the forms. In other words, how to make the forms look good. All right, how to style the forms. We will talk about accessibility with forms. In other words, forms provide some special challenges to people that are visually impaired. And then finally, we'll talk about HTML5 form controls, because with HTML5 there was some new things introduced that can really help you out, but there's some sort of catches with them too. Namely, not all browsers support them. So let's start out with the example we had last time and review it, and then we'll go and expand on it. So, here's the example we had last time. If we bring it up, we have a text box. By a text box, I mean a box that has the opportunity for you to put in a single line of text. I'll make it look bigger. I'll zoom in a bit. You hold the Control button down and scroll the mouse wheel. So, if I want to search for HTML, I type that in and click the submit button, and that is hooked to Google's search engine. So the server-side script brings up the web search based on HTML. And we can do that for anything. We talked about last time how forms supply input to server-side scripts. Remember that server-side scripts are pages that take user input or other factors and dynamically create a page for each request that they're given. In other words, it's not like there is a web page already written out there in HTML for in case someone does a search for CSS, right? This page is created, all right, on the fly. So there's a program at the other end, a script, that takes the input, takes some other factors, and assembles this from scratch. And we can sort of tell that our results are customized for us because if we Google something like Italian restaurant, it will show us ones specifically in this area. 10 best in Lorraine, 10 best near Elyria, 10 best in Lorain County, the Olive Garden at the Midway Mall, and so on. Right. Right. So that sort of leads us to say that those results are customized for us. So they're customized based on a number of factors. They're customized based on what we've typed in. In other words, it showed us Italian restaurants, not Greek restaurants, right? It's customized based on that the web server knows about us, namely our location. And it's customized based on what restaurants open and close. In other words, if a new Italian restaurant opened next week and they create a website, pretty soon that would start showing up in the search. All this without someone going in and manually changing an HTML page. So that's the whole idea of server-side scripts, is that they're not completed web page, they're scripts, which take the user input and take other factors and create an HTML page on the fly. We're not going to study server-side scripting in this class. All right, we're just going to identify that that's what it does, and we're going to focus on the HTML end of things, which oftentimes is to provide that server-side script with form data, with the answers. So if we were to look at this code, we'll see a few things. We have a form tag. There's two attributes on the form tag that are important. One is the method and one is the action. The action is the name of the script at the other end that handles the input and produces a page. So it's the web page. The only difference being is it's not an HTML page, it's going to be a server-side script. So the name of this is, the name of the Google search page is https://www.google.com/search. I got that simply by doing a search in Google and looking at the URL. And I see the URL before the question mark. That is the URL I want to put in because that is the name of the script. Now, if you are developing a web application, typically you're going to be writing the client and the server-side code. All right, so you'll know the name of the script because chances are you wrote it. Or if you didn't write it, someone else on your team has written it. So finding out the name of the script isn't that hard. Even in the case where I did it, it just required just a teeny bit of detective work of looking at the URL. So that's the action. The action is the name of the script which is going to process the data. If you omit the action, the page submits back to itself. See, it just called itself back. A return, right. And that's not rare. And I can tell that it called itself back because I can see the data on the query string. So sometimes you do that. All right? Sometimes you have a script that calls back itself. That's not rare at all. All right? Sometimes the code that you write for a form contains both the form and the code to process the form. So if you omit the action, it calls back itself. The other attribute of the form tag is a method of get or a method of post. With a method of get, it passes the data on the query string. So notice if I do a search, I can see on the query string the two fields from the form. The field named Q and the field called button submit. If I change that to get, if I change that get to post, it still sends the data, but it does it in a way that you can't see. So notice you don't see that. It still sends the data, but it does it in a transparent way. For most examples that we do, we're going to have a get and we're going to have a specific action. Now, notice the names of these. This is, again, I did a little detective work. I saw that when you do a normal Google search, that the value that you're searching for is in a variable on the query string called Q. So that's why when I made this text box, input type equals text, name equals Q, I called it Q. Because I knew when I did a regular Google search that the thing that I'm searched for is on the query string. Somewhere we'll find it, right here, called Q. Remember, the query string consists of the name of a variable, an equal sign, and a value. So field name equals value. So in this case, the thing that Google, the search script is expecting the thing that I'm searched for to be named Q. And then the value of that's going to be whatever it's going to search for. So therefore, I have to call this text box Q. If I call it something else, Google search doesn't work because it's not getting what it expects. Now, again, usually you are the one that's responsible for writing the client and the server-side script. If it's not you, it's someone on your team. So you will know what you need to call it. In the case of your homework assignment, I told you what you need to call it. All right? Finally, and again, the button submit, sometimes we can use the value of the button as well. All right, last thing, get versus post. Google search is expecting that data to be on the query string, not passed the other way. And therefore, if we do this and pass it on the query string, or don't pass it on the query string, it doesn't know what to do either. So we have to follow the rules of what the server is expecting. We have to provide the data in the way that it needs it. And in this case, Google's script needs it on the query string, so we need to use get. That's the name of the script that we have to call, and the field that we're searching for has to be named Q. And if we do all that, our Google search will work. If we don't do one of those, then our search no longer works. All right? Now again, that's usually not a problem because usually we're the ones that write the server-side script too, or again, someone on your team. In this case, I just looked at the URL and figured out what it needed. Now all it needs is that variable Q. There's other variables that you can pass to, but all we really need is a variable Q. All right, so that's the basics that we covered from last time. Let's play around this a little bit more. And let's put next to this a label. Because right now the form is really bare bones. Just contains a box. So I'm going to put search for. All right. Now here's the thing that you might not think of. We know, those of us that can see, know that this label belongs to that box. Why? Because it's right next to it. Okay? So, pardon me? Well, it's here. It's right next to it. It's before the input. So we know that this belongs to this. The user knows. Again, the user isn't looking at the code. So the user knows that that belongs to that label because it's right next to it. What about someone that can't see? They can't see, especially if there's a lot of fields on the page. They can't see what goes with what. They have a screen reader that's going to narrate to them the different text, and it's not always easy to tell what belongs with what. So there's a tag called the label tag that allows us to tie a label with a text box or other field on the screen. So The way the label tag works is this. You put the label tag around the text that is the label. The text, the label tag has an attribute 4. That says this is a label for Q. All right? And what do I mean by Q? I mean the thing that has an ID of Q. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to change the ID to QID. Just to show you that you use the ID, not the name, to match the label up with a form control. Now, that can be a little confusing because you actually have two things that sort of identify a form control. You have a name and you have an ID. You might have both on all your form controls. The ID is used for the label, and it can also be used for CSS, and it can also be used for JavaScript. The name is what the server needs. So, in this case, the name is the name that we're going to send to the server for this piece of data. The ID is used to tie the label to the form control. Now, this is one of those things that visually you don't see any difference. But if someone is accessing a page with the screen reader, it can associate these things better. All right, the screen reader can tie those things together. All right, let's do a Google, advanced Google search. Let's see, where is advanced search at? I don't remember.
I think you do www.google.com/advanced.
Okay, let's try that. Nope.
Oh, without the D. Nope.
All right, let's see if we could find it. I've gotten into it. I just don't remember where.
As Google.
As Google. There you go. Settings? Yeah, under settings is advanced search. All right. So let's say we want search in a particular language. All right, let's do some reverse engineering. So let's say I want it to be I want my search to be in English. And I want to search for HTML. Let's notice what we have. We have HL equals EN, and AS underscore Q equals HTML. So it's expecting at least two fields. I'll bet you if I put those two fields in there, I can get it to work. All right, so let's go in and let's change this guy to AS underscore Q. And let's create a second one for the language. And that was HL. All right, so now we have our two things. Search for HTML, language, EN. We do a search, and there we go. All right, let's look for another language. French. All right, there we go. We have a French search. Not bad, huh? Let's look and see Chinese simplified. Shell equals EN. Oh, LR. Should be LR, not. All right, so we did a search and got the result in Chinese, French, and so on down the line. Okay, so we're now giving two fields. Notice a couple things. All the form fields are within the form tag. Think of the form tag as being like an envelope that you're putting in a request to the server. So everything that you're sending the server goes into a single form tag. I've had students think that there needs to be a form tag for each field. That's not the case. A submit button takes and sends everything in the form tag, that is the whole envelope, and sends it to the server. All right. Questions about this? Now, we're going to do a little bit of styling here. And for simplicity, I'm going to put the style code in the same page as this. Okay? Just because. All right? Now, right now, if you notice it, even with two fields, that's not too bad. But if we had 3, 4, 5 fields to have a continuous row of them, input tags are inline tags, so that's not really going to look good. So what I suggest doing is, what is a form? A form is really just a list of things that we're sending to the server. And they don't necessarily have a natural order, right? You might think, well, I'm going to put in my name before my address, but you could put in the address first. It's not going to violate any rules. So I'm going to make an unordered list to put my form stuff in. And each form element is going to be an LI. So this will put everything on its own line. But it's still not going to look very good. All right, so now if I do this, it'll be stacked on top of each other. Okay, now it still doesn't look particularly pretty. All right, so I'm going to do some things to make this look better. I'm going to get rid of the bullet points. How do we get rid of the bullet points? It's in the CSS, you're absolutely right.
Navigation, UL equals
List style type, none. Very good. All right, that looks better, but I kind of don't like that these don't line up right. All right, let's see if we can make them line up correct. I'm going to give the label a width, and I don't think that's going to work. And it doesn't really work. I think if both of those have a width of 100 pixels, they'd be the same size, right? That's because, again, a label is a inline tag, and as such, it doesn't have all the tags, all the attributes that a block tag does. So I have to say display inline block. And if I do that, then, oh, now those line up very nice. I can even make these text align to the right. So I get the labels lining up, the right side of the labels lining up going down, and that'll make for a very neat. So I can say text align right. And I have that. Now, I want some space between things. Probably as a margin on my LIs. Because I want the space between the stuff. So I'll give a margin of 5 pixels. I gave some space in between it. This one, maybe I want to treat differently. Maybe I want to put the button over here. So maybe I put a class of button on this and say everything that has a class of button, make text align right. And I have a button over there. So notice how with just a little bit of tweaking we made this form look pretty nice. All right. There's other things we could do as well to maybe make it more attractive. We could put a border around the whole form. All right, and so on. But I want to come back to the language. All right, because there are certain languages that we can type in and it will recognize them, but we can't literally type anything in there. For example, if I want to do HTML, I can't type in French here. Doesn't know what that means. What did we have to type in for French? We have to type in lang-fr. You're right. Okay. Now that's a lot to expect the user to know, right? What is the code for Spanish? I would think it would be lang_yes, or maybe it's SP. Okay. Looks like ES works. what is the code for German? Well, you know that, but I might think it's GE. It doesn't work. So I type in DE. And that works. The point is these are specific codes that any individual may or may not know. All right? So a text box doesn't seem like a good option for that. What do they do on Google's own advanced search? Well, they give you a drop-down where you can pick the thing that you want to search for. And that way, I don't need to know what it is. Let's pick Polish. Do an advanced search. Lang equals underscore PL. All right? So we can't just type anything in this field. So a text box is not a good choice for that. All right? What would be a good choice for this? Yes? Maybe a radio button. What is a radio button? A radio button is where you have a button on the page, and these buttons on the page, and they're organized into groups. And you can only select one item from each group. So if we did a radio button for language, we'd have English, Spanish, Chinese, Polish, whatever. And they could only pick one. And when they picked one, everything else gets unpicked. It's like your car radio. You can't listen to two stations at the same time. You're listening to station 1 or you're listening to station 2. A radio button would be a good choice. What would be another possible choice?
The drop-down box.
Drop-down box. How would we decide which we would want to use?
The number of options you have.
Probably the number of options. Maybe we would want to keep the form consistent. So if we were using radio buttons for other things, maybe we would want to use radio buttons for this. But I would say probably the main thing that I would look at would be how many options do I have. All right? So if you have a list of defined options, and it has to be one of those options, don't use a text box. Use instead a drop-down or a radio button. And they basically work the same way in the sense that typically they're used to give us just one option. All right, so let's create a drop-down for this. Excuse me. Thought there was something else I was going to say. Oh, the one advantage that a radio button would have is you'd see all the choices laid out in front of you without having to click on it. But the other, the disadvantage of that is that if there's many, many choices, it will take up a lot of space. So, there's a different tag for a drop-down. It is a select tag. It needs to have a name, and the name has to match what the server is expecting. Now here's an interesting thing. We're going to change this from a text box to a drop-down. The server-side script doesn't care. As long as the thing that it's getting is called LR, all right, and it has the proper value in it, doesn't care if we used a radio button or a drop-down or a text box. We just have to supply the proper data for it. So I'm going to say name equals LR, ID equals LR. And then we have our list of options inside the drop-down. An option has two parts. It has a value, and then it has what the user is going to see. So, the value is what is going to be sent to the server for processing. So, what did we need to send to the server for processing for English? I think it was lang underscore en. And that's English. lang underscore FR for French. And we can do as many of them as we need. I'm organizing them alphabetically. It's generally good to have some organization in your drop-down so it's obvious to your user what order they're in. Another possibility would be to organize them according to the frequency that people might use it, especially putting like the default on top. Okay, so select goes around all of these. It has the name that the server is expecting. It has the ID that's going to match it up with the label. Each option has a value, which is what's going to be sent to the server, and then has sort of the description that the user is going to understand. So in this case, lang underscore en is what the server is expecting, but a user might not know what that meant, so we put in user-friendly terms what that represents, and that represents English. Likewise, lang underscore fr represents French, pl represents Polish, es equals Spanish. So now, we don't have a text box for there, we have a drop down. So we can type in search for HTML, language, Polish, do the search, and there we go. Let me translate for you. HTML means hypertext markup language. Okay, I don't know what the rest of it means. All right, or search for Spanish.
I know that one.
All right.
Oh, what kind of Spanish is that?
It might be. I'd have to look at the language code. This might be if there's different like dialects. It might be like the from Spain versus from Latin American countries. There might be a separate code for
I
that.
still understand, but
Right.
Kind of like it's hard for me to just
Right.
read it very fast like normal I do.
Right. So, ideally, that's what you want to do. You want to keep your users from being able to make a mistake, right? And in the case of those language codes, they could put something wrong in. You know, they have to understand how it works. They have to understand that it starts LANG underscore and then has a 2-character code. Well, that's a lot to remember. I wouldn't expect my users to remember that and be able to do it properly. Instead, give them a list. And with a drop-down, you can, again, make the list contain the value that the server needs, but have the explanation, have the text that specifies the way the user is going to understand it. Now, let's do the same thing with the radio button. I'll make a copy of this form, and we'll do the same thing with the radio buttons. I'm going to come back in and put the labels in later. radio button, instead of type equal text, it will be type equals radio. It will have a value that will represent the value that will get sent to the server. So for English, lang_en. It will also have a name, which has to be what the server expects, and the server is expecting LR. It's also going to have an ID, which is going to be different than the name, because each radio button is going to have the same name, but each radio button is going to have a different ID. So I'm going to go and duplicate this for the languages that we had. I do.
Where you can find
The codes?
the codes, like language, like Spanish, stuff like that. How you can find, you know, so you can check it for different type of language.
I believe if I search for international language code, I believe it uses these, which would be like the 2-character code. So like Arabic would be AR, English would be EN. I just sort of reverse engineered. I looked in, I did a Google search and saw what the name was. It's fine because this is like sort of in alphabetical order, but not exactly. English is EN. Spanish, Castilian. Is, yeah, for Spain, ES. Well, if anyone was in the United Kingdom, the claim would probably be that people in the United States don't speak English too. So, okay, but yeah, you can find them. I just did a Google search and just noticed what it said up on the thing. So notice that they all are going to have the same name. That's what makes them act as radio buttons. They all are going to have a different ID because when I eventually put the label in, I need the ID. So I'm going to not have the label in for these to start, and we'll view the way the page looks. Okay, don't really like how that looks, but we can tweak the style for this. But notice as I click around, as I make one selection, the other selection changes. If I didn't give them their own radio button name, if I called this LR1, LR2, LR3, LR4, it wouldn't be good, because then it would no longer work like a radio button. So having a name the same is what ties them together and treats them like a radio button. Has nothing to do with the fact that they're next to each other on the screen or anything like that. So let's make this a little wider. All right. So now I could search for HTML and say I wanted it in Polish, and boom, there's the search. So in a nutshell, type equals radio. The value, it represents what's going to be sent to the server. The name is the name of the field that's going to be sent to the server. All your radio buttons will have the same name. All right? And then finally, your ID will be unique for each radio button so that I can put a label in. What I'm going to do real quick, just to polish this off, is I'm going to go and put in the labels, and I'm going to use a nested list. So a list inside of a list. Yeah, so these will be neat. Some students get a little confused about the label simply because we don't see anything on the screen with the label. That again, assistive technology though makes use of that label. So this should be a little neater way of doing it. We have a language, and then we have the choices between languages. You can only pick one. Okay. So next week, we've gone over a lot that deals with accessibility because a label is an important thing. We're going to talk about a couple other things that we can do to help with the accessibility. We will go over other form controls, and we'll cover HTML5 controls. And I think that's probably it as far as forms go. Really, for the last, this is end of week 12, so we have week 13, 14, and 15. The biggest thing for you will be getting your project done. There'll be a few more assignments. One will be about tables. One will be regarding JavaScript. Now, I know we're a little behind on the lectures, so if you need a little extra time to finish up some of the labs, that's fine. All right, so don't sweat it thinking that because we haven't covered something, that you still need to turn it in on time. I think the lab that's due this week is on forms, and we sort of have enough for you to do it now. You could probably do most of it now. But again, if it takes you a little bit of extra time to finish it, that's okay. All right, and by all means, if you have questions, let me know. All right, that's all I had. I'll be up in lab. You'd send it to a script, and that script would create an email. Yeah, you'd send it to a server-side script, and that server-side script would compose and send an email. So like look up PHP send email, and there'll probably be a sample script of how to do that. It would have to be running on a server that had an email server, and you would create an object, create a mail object, fill in the parameters, and send the email.
And you said what kind of object you create again? An email object?
Yeah, it would be a way to create an email in PHP. And if it was running on a website with an email server, you could create and send the email to someone. Just Google PHP send email, and I'm sure it will have what you need.